Morning, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Yes. So I just want to make sure I'm in the right room. I did have a suit jacket on, and after seeing this crowd, I said, all right, I at least need to get rid of the jacket, or it'll be very awkward. So anyway, good morning to you all. Thank you for having me. I'm going to entertain you with some PowerPoint, but before we start there, how many people in the room know what's ATO? Yeah. Awesome. I know I'm in DC. Yes. What I'll be talking to you about a little bit is, we're obviously here in Washington, D.C., lots of government, lots of compliance, lots of regulation. But what's interesting is we find that there's a lot of interest in security compliance, lots of questions on where do we start, what do we do, not just in D.C., not just in government, public sector, but other places. So really my talk today is to share with you some experiences we've had around automation, compliance, ATO, NIST 800-53, and all of that. So before that, I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion that makes sure that people pay for me to get here and talk to you. So I'm the CEO and founder of Stack Armor. We are a 3-year-old startup. We focus on really helping our customers get onto commercial cloud platforms such as AWS and others that have gone through the FedRAMP accreditation process. So classic startup story, we work both on the federal side as well as the public sector side. Right now, we've done some really interesting things around automation and building IP around sort of helping customers go through the ATO process. So really, in terms of different kinds of programs, as you can imagine, for any startup, it's great to get industry validation. And this couple of weeks ago, we were very happy to be selected as one of 8 companies by Amazon as part of the ATO and AWS program. So at this point, I end my selfless self-promotion. So let's go in and talk a little bit about why you're here. So obviously, organizations are rapidly moving into the cloud. And so nobody needs to sort of be told about this, but it's very clear the hockey stick is taking off, and we're seeing large migrations into the cloud. But there is also obviously some challenges that we need to go in and deal with. So I'm sure all of you are reading some of these industry reports. So while it's great that we've got cloud-based infrastructure, whether it is Amazon, whether it is Google, Microsoft, Azure, others. But the interesting thing is there is a complex interplay of new technologies, new types of users and developers and DevOps and sort of all of this change that's driving a different set of discipline and change in how we go in and deploy systems, secure them, right? So in the traditional sort of sense, when you had IT infrastructure, there was sort of this ops crew that would make sure that everything is locked down, and you had sort of these IT silos. Those are being broken down. Now we have developers that are supposed to break things as they fix. They're supposed to fix things as they break. They're also supposed to focus on security. So obviously, as things are very, very dynamic, we used to be able to go in and certify a system once, and it would stay this way. Not so with DevOps and infrastructure as code and auto scaling and things like that. And of course, we are seeing a huge increase in regulation, right? So people are familiar with things like GDPR. There's a similar law in California. There's another one coming up in Massachusetts. And so just across the landscape, we are seeing an increase in using things like ATO, NIST, FedRAMP, not just in federal. So I'm sure you're sort of experiencing some of those trends. So this talk is not just for people that are in the federal space. We do a lot of work in the commercial space as well. I had a conversation recently with an executive at Marriott, and what we sort of find is that the NIST security framework by far is the most mature framework that exists. And so CISOs, CIOs, CTOs, they're looking for sort of the entry point or the starting point. And so we believe NIST 800-53 is a great starting point for you to make sure that you're looking at your security posture in a holistic way. So again, it doesn't mean it's just for federal agencies or public sector organizations. We see across the board, there are a lot of RFPs now where we are seeing nonprofit organizations that, for example, get federal grants, things like that. They have started to sort of say and talk about NIST security standards. So again, what we recommend is begin and pick a what we call a legally defensible standard. The NIST cybersecurity framework, and particularly NIST 800-53, has been used by the federal government for a long time, and so it's a good standard to begin your journey with. I won't bore you with all the details of the lingo. I'm sure all of you are pretty familiar. But obviously, security is hard, and compliance is harder. So how does DevOps sort of play into this? So again, this is our playbook. So what you want to do is you want to start off with not reinventing the wheel, right? So go in and start with standards that have already been approved. And so these three standards in particular, 800-53, the CIS benchmarks, and OWASP are great in terms of covering the different parts of your stack. The second thing is go in and obviously begin with sort of a great foundation, but then go in and start to design and architect to that security foundation. You'll be amazed at the number of companies I meet almost on a daily basis that want to, for example, go in and sell into the federal government, and simple things like hard, strong password policies, disabling passwords in 3 tries. I mean, simple things that you would imagine exist are just not as widely prevalent as one would hope. And so those are what we call low-hanging fruit, obviously. So I think by beginning your journey with 800-53 or the NIST security framework, and then sort of designing your architecture, or at least mapping your architecture to those requirements, is a great first step. And then, obviously, everything may not work out of the box. Things like MFA, multi-factor authentication, et cetera, are required. A lot of applications do not offer that out of the box, so you may have to look at compensatory controls, and there are solutions for that. And then, obviously, we want to look at acceleration, right? So you don't have the luxury of taking many, many months and hundreds or millions of dollars to go and do it. So we want to go in and look at how cloud technology specifically can help us get through this journey a little bit faster. So we at Stack Armor have been working on this problem for a while. And so this, at a high level, are sort of what we call the 5 key pillars to developing a holistic security architecture and solution. So again, a lot of times what happens is in cloud-based systems, I've been doing cloud for almost 10 years. I did the first migration for a system called recovery.gov 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago in July of 2009. And it's still amazing on how many people still feel, oh, if I move it into a commercial cloud service like Amazon or Azure or Google, it'll be somehow magically taken care of. So the idea of the shared responsibility model still exists. You still have to protect your application. You still have to do things around security operations, continuous monitoring. We get asked a lot of questions around hardening, right? So CIS benchmarks, for those of you that are doing DoD work, disastigs, things like that. Again, not as common practice as you would sort of hope. But again, looking at those is important. You want to have hardened cloud operations. So again, I won't read through all of these, but the idea is to go in and think of this holistically. One of the things that happens a lot, and I'll share with you some sort of day-to-day perspectives, one of the biggest things we find in today's culture from a cloud, DevOps, et cetera standpoint is that the security and compliance teams still operate outside of what I would call the DevOps orbit. And I think it's a cultural problem. It's also, I think, a framework problem. I'll show you some interesting findings in that space. So again, you want to go and have an integrated team, and I think the SRE framework, as an example, sort of talks to a little bit. So here is sort of a security services catalog. So this, by any means, is not an end-all, be-all. But again, as we have gone in and implemented sort of the NIST 800-53 requirements on cloud environments. These are typically the tools that we use. Again, it's not an endorsement for all of these products, but more about the capabilities that you need. You can use any tool that you like, but these are just some solutions or tools that we've seen a lot of. Another interesting thing that we find, especially around security and compliance as it relates to cloud, a lot of people talk about managed services providers, MSPs, things like that. We just feel that the ability to go in and follow the data and figure out where it is and where it is going and where it sits is absolutely critical. And so what we believe is that as you're architecting these systems, sort of this notion that you need to have many, many system interconnections, use different kinds of services, you're better off putting your security capabilities as close as possible into your system boundary. It reduces the need for interconnections. It reduces other types of supply chain risk. And if you do that, what we've found from experience is as you go sort of through your accreditation process, whether it's with a government agency or internally, you'll find that your due diligence and accreditation process reduces by at least 30 to 40%, just because your sort of footprint of the things that you need to worry about, the things that you need to do due diligence about, are fewer. So again, you can use things like CloudFormation, Ansible, Terraform, whatever sort of automation service that you're interested in, but you can package up all of these security capabilities and basically deploy them inside the boundary of the system. It's a lot easier today than it used to be a couple of years ago. So again, keep in mind an in-boundary deployment where there is fewer opportunities for data to leave the environment, especially in the context of security, compliance, and monitoring. So this is, for those of you that like punishment, this is a really dense chart. We really need to do a better job of sort of providing this information. But as those of you that are looking to DevOps and automation, so this is essentially a workbook of the NIST or 800-53 moderate controls. There are about 325 controls. And this really what we're trying to show is, a lot of you that have gone through this sort of pain and exercise associated with this, you sort of start from scratch and you go in and try and sort of work your way through these controls. But what we've found in experience is if you do this right, if you go in and use FedRAMP accredited cloud services and you do sort of some of the things around automation, we think you can start at the halfway mark. Essentially, you can implement a lot of the management, security, and control, monitoring controls, and sort of get 50% coverage of those controls. So essentially, those are some of the things that this color coding talks about. Another thing is with new technology and processes, there are always some interesting new challenges. So we think that as you're looking to use things like DevOps or DevSecOps, there are some areas that you want to pay close attention to. So again, the things that are in red, and I apologize for those folks in the back, these slides will be available online. And again, there are some specific areas that you want to go and pay special attention to. So DevOps and automation does come with some of its own risks. So again, this is sort of a quick way to go in and understand the impact, both good and bad, that you need to care about. So I want to sort of switch tracks a little bit. I know we're here at a DevOps conference, and so it's interesting. When we go in and interview product owners or we interview and engage with different organizations that are big into cloud, and we start to sort of have a discussion with them on what they see are their roles and responsibilities, what's amazing is this is sort of at a high level the sort of roles and responsibilities that pop out. And the reason I highlighted some of the things around the security aspect in red, it's woefully inadequate, especially in today's environment where there are advanced persistent threats. You have state actors and others. I think this is just not good enough. And so right now I'm having an interesting debate on Twitter related to an article I wrote some time back, so you're welcome to join that conversation. But the number one issue that I find that we run into is the responsibility for security is still not well understood. And I think the developers and the operations folks still have a little bit of a journey to travel in terms of really understanding that security is a core responsibility. Just for giggles, I wrote an article around our agile and DevOps frameworks responsible for security vulnerability issues that we see. And so, again, this is not a ding on any framework, but the idea is, all of these frameworks need to evolve. So, go ahead and read this article, but I just did a simple search on a very popular agile framework, and I just searched for the word security in the job description of a product owner and manager, not a single reference. I looked at the core functions or the core principles of product development in one of the agile frameworks, not a single reference to security. And this is pervasive. And so the point of this conversation is to go in and say, look, I think agile, DevOps, things like that, they've gotten us to this point. We need to evolve. And hopefully today, if you're sort of in that space, you want to take a look at what are the things that we can collectively do as a community interested in this space. So how do we go and move forward, right? So I think we've had some debates on whether it should be DevSecOps or DevOps and that sort of thing. I do think strongly that adding the word security in DevOps is important, not necessarily for driving quantitative changes. I think everybody knows security is important, but I think it's more to drive the cultural change. And so what we see as sort of the new path forward, or I would say what should be the path forward, is you want to focus on driving cultural change by adding sort of this concept of security, and more so for essentially driving change from the top. It's not good enough for you to have a CISO or an IA or an ISSO or a security person, because quite honestly, they will not be able to protect you. They will not be able to protect the data. They will not be able to protect the users. It is everybody's responsibility, and so you've got to go in and put that front and center. You've got to stick it into the roles and responsibilities, right? So these are just some examples of things you want to make sure that as you're sort of going through this journey, it's not just about the tools and the technology and the automation. I think that's great, but still people and what they do is very, very important. So again, just some insights based on some of the work we've done. Here is an interesting case study we did for a large federal agency. And so this is where I sort of made that comment that security and compliance is a little bit outside of the orbit of traditional sort of DevOps or CI/CD. And so in this particular agency's case, they were very progressive. They understood the need to go in and bring in the security and compliance functions. So from our standpoint, it was a 50-50 problem, meaning 50% was cultural change and 50% was technology. And so the way we tackle this is just sort of a simple flow chart that shows you how a traditional CI/CD pipeline may be implemented. The things in the middle are the pieces that we added to go in and pull in the CISO and the security organization into the CI/CD pipeline. And so in terms of really the lessons learned, what we found was as long as the security and compliance organization had a voice and had also what I would call the pause button. In other words, if they felt that they were part of the, let's say, your CI/CD pipeline, Jenkins, what have you, and there were gates in that pipeline that they had access to and control over, we felt that the resistance to going in and implementing some of these solutions dropped. And of course, there's some engineering work involved. These are just some tools that we used. You have to do things like mapping and things like that. But most mature DevOps shops know how to do this. But it's more of the cultural piece and essentially giving the security organization sort of the comfort that A, security is being handled, B, that they do have a say in it, and they have sort of this stop button or this pause button. I think it helps sort of move things along. So this organization has done, I think, an exceedingly good job. This is a Azure-based deployment. They used Chef pretty extensively, and so and the interesting thing there was, most information assurance people, they love Excel workbooks, Word, PowerPoint templates. That's how sort of traditional security and compliance is done. But actually, they were doing security and compliance as code. So a lot of chef recipes, things like that, were being written that were actually owned by the CISO organization. So a complete different talent and skill set. And I think that basically led to a lot of interest in people around cloud security compliance to sort of want to be part of that organization. So again, it's like I said, it's always 50% a people problem, culture, talent, reskilling, things like that, and then obviously the technology piece of it. We have a written case study on our website. If you're interested in knowing more, let me know. But again, I think we were pretty successful here in helping this organization sort of embrace DevSecOps. So let's talk a little bit about some of the interesting things that we see today. Supply chain risk, I think, is topic number one. I'm sure all of you are reading this in sort of the press, that if you care to read those kind of things. Essentially what this means is we particularly take a lot of care in doing due diligence on the components that we select. So we were just doing a project for a fairly large publicly traded security healthcare company in the Bay Area, and their developers came back with a list of, I won't take names, but they came back with a list of some interesting open source solutions, which maybe 5 years ago, nobody would have batted an eyelid and said, yep, that makes sense, let's go and put that in. But there is a lot of sensitivity on where is the code coming from, who are the people behind it, what's sort of the community footprint. And so, we very quickly sort of were able to go and show them what kind of risks they might go in and might encounter. So again, you've got to do your due diligence. So one of the things, for example, we recommend is if you're using a SaaS service, find out where's your data hosted, simple things. Is it a FedRAMP accredited SaaS service? So it's not just about government, but it helps in doing your due diligence. But I think the number one thing I would tell you is, look at what you're putting into your environment and make sure that you're comfortable with what it means. Another interesting thing that comes up with DevOps is sort of what I call the automation exhaust. Most of us in sort of the security space are familiar with this concept of privileged users, systems administrators. People have elevated privileges to be able to go and make changes. But more and more, it's not a human being anymore. It's actually code. And so, you've got these powerful scripts or, infrastructure as code, DevOps pipelines, things like that. So how do you go in and make sure that that sort of privileged user as code is under configuration management, is being scanned, you've tested it, and somebody is not fiddling around with it? So again, an interesting take on a old problem, but it's just not a human being anymore. It's code, for example, that's being written. Another interesting thing that happens is, especially in the area of forensics, again, there are requirements to go in and do it, or troubleshooting. You've got a lot of dynamic activity going on in your cloud environment. And so, what that essentially means is logging and monitoring has to be really robust. We had a situation where, as part of the auto-scaling groups, we had an instance that got breached, but it was gone. So you can't now, when you go looking for it, you don't find it, right? So again, you have to be prepared to deal with those kind of situations as you're sort of entering this new world around automation. So I promised to tell you a little bit more about NIST, ATO, and cybersecurity controls. So here is an example for those of you who are, just to keep you entertained around my knowledge about the security controls in the NIST framework. So again, the point of it is just to sort of take a new look at some of these controls, and security is an old thing. Obviously, you're very comfortable with it, but there are some really interesting new things that start to come up different types of new roles, right? So you've got, let's say, a cloud administrator or a DevOps administrator that doesn't go in and touch the console, or doesn't go in and touch a single Linux server or Windows server or what have you, but they have elevated privileges into the configuration of the cloud system. So different types of access, different kinds of ability to go in and cause harm potentially. So you'd want to make sure that those roles are adequately defined, and you have controls in place to go in and manage those. Here are, again, some interesting controls that I think all of you are pretty familiar with, where you can get a lot of acceleration, right? So I want to go in and make sure that I've got immutable infrastructure. I've got my agents, my security. I've got a system that's reasonably well-baked and stable. And I can go ahead and use things like DevOps pipelines, infrastructure as code to update that, and that update sort of pervasively goes into my cloud environment. Again, those kinds of tasks and activities used to be hard, and it's a lot simpler now. There's a lot more automation. There are a lot more what we call cloud-native services that are available to you to be able to do some of those difficult tasks. And so that is sort of a quick overview of DevSecOps and automation that I wanted to sort of walk you through. I'm not quite sure what the protocol is, if I'm allowed to take questions, or you're all sufficiently dazzled by my presentation and speechless. Any questions from the audience? Are you guys doing ATO automation? No, I think I've got them spellbound.